In part A of our session on molecules of life, we will review essential chemistry to set the chemical context for life, and to review concepts that will be helpful to understand both biological molecules and energy metabolism. We'll talk about elements. We'll talk about an essential property of elements called electronegativity, which is important to understand and predicts how atoms form bonds and what kinds of bonds form. And finally, we'll close with defining what's so special about organic molecules. Let's start off by looking at the elements that are found in all living organisms. Here we have a table of the elements listed on the order of abundance or mass in the human body. As you can see, oxygen and hydrogen are two of the most abundant elements, and that makes a lot of sense because the human body is 70% water, and water, of course, is H2O. In addition to oxygen and hydrogen, however, what we find is carbon and nitrogen. Okay? So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are four of the most abundant elements found in the human body. If we look at other organisms, what we'll see is that maybe they don't have calcium because calcium is for our bones and it's a mineral form. But if we look at biomolecules, or the so-called organic molecules, we find that we have two other important elements. That's phosphorus and sulfur. And here I'm using the single letter designation for each of these elements. So sulfur is S and phosphorus is P. Potassium, curiously enough, is K. So as I said, calcium is an element found in bone. In addition, we see other elements like potassium, sodium, and chlorine. And all of these are minerals found in our body that are usually in the form of solutes, except for calcium, which is in bone. Okay? And these are required for physiological osmoregulation and ion balance. But they're inorganic and they can be found in lots of other places. What is special about living organisms is the abundance of these elements in biomolecules. If we look at the abundance of these elements in ocean water, after all, life originated in the ocean, and we would expect to have traces of the composition of water. In the ocean, what we find is that, of course, we find hydrogen and oxygen as the most abundant elements because of water. We find that carbon is relatively rare. Okay? Another is nitrogen. So both carbon and nitrogen are much more rare in the ocean water, and they're also much more rare in the crust than you would find in the human body. Now, nitrogen is abundant in the air, but as dinitrogen. So in terms of the molecules of life, these are 6 elements are the most important. Okay? And now we're going to look at why these elements combine in the way they do to make organic molecules. So the basic thing is, how does carbon combine with all those 5 other elements, okay, to form organic molecules? To help understand how these elements react with each other and with other molecules, we need to look at the properties of these elements. So the periodic table actually helps us to understand how elements react with each other to form chemical bonds. So if you recall, or maybe you don't, the periodic elements table of the elements lists all the elements in order by atomic number. So the atomic number is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus. So I expect you to know that the basic model of atomic structure is that we have a nucleus of protons and protons and or neutrons, and we have electrons, negatively charged electrons, orbiting the nucleus containing positively charged protons. So what defines an element is the number of protons in its nucleus. So any atom that has 1 proton in its nucleus is hydrogen. Any atom that contains 6 protons in its nucleus is carbon. In neutral elements, the number of electrons is equal to the number of protons, so the element has no net charge. So what's important and key to this periodic table is that in addition to the atomic number, the elements are also arranged in these horizontal rows by the valence shell electrons. So when electrons orbit the nucleus, they occupy different energy levels. In the first row, the electrons occupy the lowest level of energy. They're closest to the nucleus, and they're in what's called a 1s shell, which really isn't important for us to understand at this point. But what we need to understand is this shell, or energy level for electrons, has room for only 2. So the capacity in that first shell is only 2 electrons. When you get to an atomic number of 3 with lithium, the innermost shell of electrons is filled, and then the third electron occupies a higher level, or the second level energy level of electrons. And the second energy level of electrons in this row has room for 8 electrons at this energy level. So lithium has 2 electrons in the innermost energy level and fills that innermost energy level, and then has 1 electron in the outermost energy level. Okay? So room for 8 electrons in the valence shell. So the valence shell is the outermost layer of electrons. And the outermost layer of electrons, or the valence electrons, are the most important because these are the electrons that interact when 2 atoms get together and form a bond. So looking at our most important elements for organic molecules, carbon with 6 protons has 6 electrons. Its 6 electrons, 2 of those electrons are in the innermost shell, and then it has 4 electrons in its valence shell. Nitrogen, with 7 electrons, has 5 electrons in its valence shell. So carbon has 4 valence electrons. Nitrogen has 5 valence electrons. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. Okay. Now, all of these atoms want to fill, in some fashion, their outermost shell of electrons. Okay. So this energy level has room for 8 electrons. So when atoms combine and form chemical reactions and bonds with each other, they're going to swap or share electrons so that each atom has a full complement of electrons in its valence shell. Therefore, when carbon reacts with hydrogen, carbon has 4 valence electrons, and I'm using these dots to represent valence electrons. Hydrogen has 1 valence electron. Okay. So now in this arrangement, if this pair of electrons is shared between carbon and hydrogen, now hydrogen has 2 electrons in its valence shell, which fills its valence shell. Remember, hydrogen has only room for 2 electrons in its valence shell, so it's happy. But carbon now has only 5, and it's not happy. However, it can fill its valence electrons by reacting with more hydrogens. So this molecule, methane, by forming, with carbon forming 4 bonds, meaning it shares 4 pairs of electrons with 4 different hydrogen atoms, now has a total of 8 electrons in its valence shell, and it's now a happy molecule. So what this tells us then is that carbon molecules can form 4 covalent bonds. And we can represent that with an electron pair diagram as such, or we can simply use a dash connecting atoms as another representation of the methane molecule. So each of these dashes represents a pair of shared electrons. Now, atoms can do more than just share electrons. For instance, atoms in this first column, the group 1 atoms, all have a single valence electron. Atoms in group 17 have nearly full valence electrons. They're just missing 1 electron. So these guys here really want 1 electron. These guys here in group 1 are definitely willing to give or donate 1 electron. Therefore, when a sodium atom with 1 valence electron runs into a chlorine atom which has 7 valence electrons, well, the sodium atom is happy to completely give up its electron. And when this electron goes to the chlorine atom, the sodium atom now has 1 less electron, so it acquires a positive charge. The number of protons and the number of electrons are unequal because it's lost an electron, and therefore sodium now has a positive charge, and it's now called an ion. Chlorine that has acquired an extra electron now has a negative charge. So this is ordinary table salt. Table salt is composed of sodium and chloride ions. So this is one extreme example where one atom really, really likes and wants to have an extra electron, and another atom is completely willing to give up its electron, and therefore in that case we get ionization and we get salt formation. Now the sodium positively charged sodium ion and the negatively charged chloride ion are strongly attracted to each other because of the opposite charges, and this is called an ionic bond. So that's at one extreme. Now when 2 carbon molecules form a bond with each other, they're sharing a pair of electrons equally between them. Okay? And this is called a covalent bond. So in covalent bond, the electrons are shared between the atoms. But some atoms have a different propensity, or they have a different attractiveness for electrons, or avidity for electrons. This property of atoms to really want to grab electrons is called electronegativity. So it's a measure of how much an atom really wants to have electrons. Oxygen, it turns out, is one of the most electronegative elements. It really wants to have electrons. Carbon and hydrogen are sort of ambiguous. They could sort of take or leave their electrons. And it's because they sort of have, you can look at their valence shell as being either half empty or half full. Oxygen is nearly full and it really wants to fill it. So it has a very strong electronegativity. So now when carbon forms a bond with oxygen, what happens is that the pair of electrons that's shared between the carbon and oxygen are shared unequally. And they spend more of their time orbiting the oxygen atom than they do carbon. Okay? So in that case, this is what we call a polar. It's still a covalent bond because the electrons are shared between them. But it's a polar bond because the electron spends more of its time around the oxygen, so that the oxygen has a slight negative charge and the carbon has a slight positive charge. The same thing happens when oxygen and hydrogen get together. So oxygen and hydrogen. Now here, even more extreme case, the electrons are spending much more of their time around oxygen, and therefore the oxygen atom has a partial negative charge, and each of these hydrogens have a partial positive charge. These are lowercase deltas that I'm trying to write here, showing that these are partial charges, not unit charges. So water is what we call a polar molecule because it has strongly polar covalent bonds. And any bond between carbon and oxygen is also going to be a polar bond. The importance of polar versus nonpolar bonds is how these molecules behave in water. So since water molecules are all polar, okay, the water molecules have partial negative charges or partial charges, and we call them dipoles, okay, because the oxygen atom has a partial positive charge, partial negative charge. Whoops. And the hydrogen atoms have a partial positive charge. So the entire molecule looks like one end is slightly negative and the other end is slightly positive. Okay? And these will interact with other polar molecules, meaning molecules with polar bonds. Okay? And as a result of this interaction, the molecules with polar they dissolve in water. And then molecules with nonpolar covalent bonds do not interact with water, and therefore they do not dissolve in the water. And we call these molecules hydrophobic, meaning they are afraid of water. The molecules with polar bonds that dissolve in water, we call them hydrophilic, meaning they love or like water. What else dissolves in water? Well, in addition to molecules that have polar bonds, ions, okay, like the sodium and chloride ions. In the absence of water, the positively charged sodium ion and the negatively charged chloride ion are strongly attracted to each other, and it's a strong bond. But if you drop table salt in water, it dissolves. And that's because all of these water molecules surround each of these ions and dissociate the sodium and the chloride ions. So all ions and polar molecules dissolve in water, and molecules that are nonpolar do not dissolve in water, and in fact, they stick together. So hydrophobic molecules, if you try to mix them in water, they will interact with each other and will avoid water. And this tendency for hydrophobic molecules to cluster together and interact with each other is called a hydrophobic interaction. All right, now let's take a look at these. So we've said that organic molecules contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur and phosphorus. Okay. So let me ask you, which of these molecules are organic molecules? So molecule A, methane, has carbon and hydrogen. Okay, so this is an organic molecule. Molecule B, carbon dioxide. Well, it's got carbon and it's got oxygen, two of the elements in organic molecules. However, this is not an organic molecule. Most people consider carbon dioxide inorganic. Well, what about carbonic acid? It has carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. Surely that's an organic molecule, right? Nope, it is inorganic. And it spontaneously forms when carbon dioxide dissolves in water. Okay. What about formic acid? It kind of looks like carbonic acid. It's got carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens. Is that inorganic? Well, actually, this is organic. Okay, so what's the difference? You can't always tell just by the elemental composition. Okay? So what's the difference between organic and inorganic, and how can we tell? The key is to look at the carbon. What is bonded to the carbon? If hydrogens or other carbons are bonded to a carbon, so you can have carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen bonds, these are organic molecules. If carbon has bonds only to oxygen, then this is an inorganic molecule. So if we go back, you see that formic acid has one bond between carbon and hydrogen. Methane has 4 carbon-hydrogen bonds, and so these are both organic. Carbon dioxide and carbonic acid, what you see is that all the bonds to carbon are with oxygen, and therefore they are inorganic. Well, is this just an arbitrary distinction, or is there some importance? Yeah. Well, when when carbon is bonded to carbon, or carbon is bonded to hydrogen, these are what we call reduced forms of carbon. And carbon dioxide is an example of oxidized form of carbon. Later, we will take a look at what oxidation and reduction means in greater detail. But for now, this is a handy tip for distinguishing organic and inorganic. For now, all you really need to know is that the reduced form of carbon is higher energy. The oxidized form of carbon is lower energy. So these are redox energy. And hence, we have the saying by the physicist Sean Carroll that the purpose of life is to hydrogenate carbon dioxide. So forming carbon-hydrogen bonds. And that life is all about making organic molecules, and therefore that's one way to look at the purpose of life.